Well, here we are. What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. If you've seen my comprehensive guide to NeuroBass Part 1 and 2, then you know that I'm constantly trying to push the ideas of sound design and the envelope further for how cool we can make our basses and just kind of what we can do. And over time, as you're continuing to grow, I'm also trying to continue to grow as well. And I've got a lot to share with you today that is hopefully going to kind of give you some insight on just how to make better basses and make them more dramatic and intricate and stuff. I've kind of gone down this interesting route of randomization, if that makes sense. And I find that the reason why I kind of lean towards that as opposed to going for exactly what I want is kind of going to be what the theme of today is all about, which is versatility. The patches that I've been designing lately, if you haven't been on my streams or noticed things in general, is having the ability to use one patch to make a wide variety of sounds just at the tip of your finger. And the reason why I like doing this is because, for one, it's taught me how to find the relationship between a lot of how effects work together, and two, it gives me inspiration to keep coming back to the same patches or same kind of patches or whatever without having the need to design more. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't make deliberate sounds or that you shouldn't take the time to figure out how to get exactly what you want, but I find that for me in particular, I have a lot more fun in the sense of discovery as opposed to trying to get something exactly how it is. I think that it's very important to say these kind of things before we get into this kind of video, or actually it's most likely going to be a series, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you have the right mindset coming into sound design, then it's a lot easier for you to appreciate what you make as opposed to, trying to recreate a patch from a really cool song that you heard. It's not to say that you shouldn't try, and it's not to say that you shouldn't, continue to strive towards recreating those sounds if that's what you're really into. But it's important to make sure that you are a sound designer or that you're a musician that sounds like you. And for the most part, up until recent, I don't really do a whole lot of videos of how to sound like this person, how to sound like this person. We will explore that later in the channel at some point, but more importantly, it's about how to develop yourself within your own sound design. So taking this stuff into account with all of this, you will start to find through hopefully this video series that I will be taking you through how to make a simple bass into how to figure out what makes a bass move. Then I'll show you the quote-unquote neuro aspects of it, and then I'll show you how to do the second part of it in the same patch, which is how to make a generator. If you don't know what neuro bass is, it's just a very processed bass, and there's a lot of different characteristics how people describe. It was kind of like coined, I guess, when neurohop kind of came about in general, or neurofunk. Neurofunk came first, but it doesn't really matter to me. It's just kind of that aesthetic in general. There's a few different kinds. The first one is kind of like the squelchy type neuro bass that you would kind of think of like Tipper and Cursa. And then you have these really low roaring basses that kind of just sound like really dark monsters that are bigger than you talking. And those are the ones that I'm more interested in covering today as opposed to the other, because the other one typically is just a lot easier to do, and I'll show you the characteristics of that when the time comes. Today we're going to be looking at part 1. It's going to be about how to take a look at making a really thick bass, and then we're going to figure out how to do some simple movement without too much processing in order to do that. The second part we'll be looking at filtering, the third part we'll be looking at the neuro aspect, and then the fourth part we'll be looking at the generator stuff. So if you like this kind of information, then please do me a favor and make sure that you're subscribed to stay up to date, and let me know what you guys think in the comments for this kind of information, or if you have any other tricks that you would either like me to cover, or if you want to share with me and open up a discussion. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into Faceplant. Now this video is going to be relatively unedited for the most part, just because I want to make sure that you see how everything is done from beginning to end. And sometimes it's nice just to be able to not have to worry so much about editing and just kind of do this from, I guess, scratch, right? Faceplant is really awesome for this, and you can do this in just about any synth. The main thing that I want to keep in mind with this is that you don't need a particular synth, you don't need a particular program, you just need to understand what goes into what and what makes what work. However, because Faceplant is so streamlined, and because it is such an easy tool to kind of show you everything that I would like to do within this, it's very easy for me to kind of keep you on track for how to demonstrate the kind of things that I'm going to show you today. So let's go ahead and start with just something super simple. Most of the time, neuro basses kind of stem from something called a Reese bass. And that was from this dude who made the bass, and kind of they named it after him, and he should have copyrighted it because he'd probably be super rich if he's not already. But what really goes into the characteristics of that is just understanding that you've got two oscillators or two voices or more that are detuned against each other. And the reason why this is so popular is because it creates a very pleasing sound called phase cancellation. So if you go into two different voices and you listen to the detuning of this, you're going to notice that we're already introducing a specific kind of movement that the higher you play a pitch, the faster it's going to quote unquote sound like it's oscillating. So take a listen to this. And so this is actually one of my favorite things to use, and probably 9 times out of 10 I actually start with something that's kind of like a saw. And I typically play this at a lower octave, but I usually turn the detuning up. But the more that you kind of get into that movement, the more that it's going to make it sound like it's actually kind of like, I don't know, it just sounds more powerful to me. There's a lot of different synthesizers that can do this, almost every single one, if not. And one thing that you can kind of make sure in order to make this a little bit thicker is to add something called distortion. Hopefully you know what distortion is, otherwise we need to have a separate conversation. And then also going into doing a little bit of notch filtering. Now the reason why we do this is because if you kind of focus on taking out some of the low mids kind of in this region, I'd say 250 to 700 hertz, then what you end up getting yourself into is having this little gap. And I can't really describe why, but having this little gap right here kind of helps this out. Take a listen. Pretty big difference, right? So one cool thing that you can kind of focus on is kind of just adjusting this in general, because just moving the cutoff of this ever so slightly is going to start to change the timbre of the sound. Hopefully you can tell the difference between all of that, and it's not the most dramatic thing, but you can kind of see that by staying in this region here, you end up getting a lot of cool, I guess I would say, like vocal tonalities. Keep that in your pocket for now, because we're going to be talking about that in just a second whenever we talk about more filtering things and whatnot. So this bass is already sounding pretty decent, but what we're going ahead and do is pump the low end up a little bit, kind of like this, and then also bring up the high end just a little bit. It's kind of interesting because this is almost like doing what this is doing, but in the opposite way. So instead of cutting this away, we're actually pushing the low and the high up. Take a listen. Now, you can achieve something like this in a lot of different ways. You can use multi-band dynamics. You can, like with upwards compression or something, you can add more distortion. You can just turn the volume up. You can pull the mids down without turning everything else up in general, but this is just a particular practice that I do. And you kind of want to keep in mind from now, and again, I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself, but you want to think about how an EQ being pushed into distortion is going to react with each other. So again, that's kind of foreshadowing into when we get to the filtering part, but just kind of keep that in mind. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually, I'm going to show you a particular trick that I've noticed or that I found through Faceplant. And I can't really describe what's happening. It's a really cool phenomenon though, but what we'll do is we'll take a saturator, and you kind of want to pull back on everything in this way, because this is just going to make it sound kind of broken, or you might like it, but it sounds like this. You can add more distortion if you want more fuzz, by all means. But I'm typically looking for a little bit more of a cleaner sound. So what we're going to do from here is add a stereo and make sure that this signal is in mono. And then from here, we're going to add an LFO. And we're going to set this to kind of like a somewhat slow rate, maybe here. If you go in and you do panning to this with the distortion and you force this into mono, then you actually introduce some kind of thing that makes it sound like a flanger, and it's really cool. Here's what it sounds like. Now that might be a little bit extreme, but I kind of wanted to make sure that you knew what this was. So even if you set this to a really small amount, you can kind of see how you can control that in this way. And the reason why I like this effect is because it's very reminiscent of if you were to bounce out a saw wave and slightly detune it in such a way. Now this doesn't move with the pitch, and you can set it to if you want it to. One cool trick that you will notice me do in some of my patches, if you haven't seen it before, is that you can actually set the center of this to something like F0, maybe F1 rather, turn the range down to 12, and then pull this down here. And now whenever this moves in pitch, it's actually going to move the flanging with it. Now that's a little bit overkill, but just to kind of demonstrate how far you can go with that, it's a pretty powerful tool. That actually sounds a lot better. So in general, you can kind of keep this into a specific place if you want, but one thing that I like to do in particular is once I kind of have something like this set up, I like to either go into adding stereo by doing one of two things or both. For one, we can think about adding another group here, and this is something that I also don't see very often, but adding another kind of high-end oscillator in this sense that is going to be an octave up. We can set this to detuning as well, but we can introduce some spread. Or we can try to introduce some effects that are going to introduce like pseudo stereo in particular. Hello, I am so sorry for interrupting this video, and I hope that you're enjoying the content. If you aren't already, I would really appreciate if you took the time to subscribe and turn the notifications on. As you can see on my analytics, only about 10% of my subscriber base are actually kind of being notified about my videos. Hit the subscribe button, turn the notifications on, help a brother out, enjoy the rest of the video. So let's do a little bit of both for now. I like this, however, it's a little bit too prominent within the mix, right? Because that kind of makes it sound like it's a little bit something else and we lose that interesting movement. So something that I like to do instead is go ahead and grab something called a randomizer here, set this to smooth, maybe something kind of slow in this way, and then introduce a little bit of level, maybe up to 50%, which is actually equal to 100% because this goes all the way up to 200%. So take a listen to this. And so thinking about this just off of the bat, it's kind of interesting because it doesn't always have that high end, but when it does, you get these subtle instances of stereo, and that can kind of be advantageous because it makes it just more diverse in that way. One other thing that you can consider is that this doesn't have to be an octave. You can set this to have multiple voices. For example, we can duplicate this with a different randomizer perhaps. Turn this up. And then this can be, say, 19 voices, or maybe we don't want this to be quite as loud. But this one will be super detuned, almost like a Hoover, and we can kind of use that to kind of introduce even more movement. Which is kind of nice. So all the other things still apply to this as well, and you don't have to do it, but you can because it's an option, and that's part of the reason why I like faceplants so much. But we can kind of use this to get creative in some other ways as well, in case if this does become too kind of prominent in other ways. For one, adding distortion to make this a little bit chunkier is not a bad idea by any means. Now, one thing that I did forget to mention was that both of these are still going out to the same output, so even though this does sound a little bit kind of thicker in that way, it's not quite as wide. So one thing that you can do to kind of fix that is to send it to lane 2 instead. And there's your stereo if you want that. However, I think that by doing the combination between the two and then adding stereo later, we've got some more high-end content, so we can actually abuse this a little bit more whenever we get to that part. So going on, now what I want to do is introduce some other kind of basic filtering, and it's not going to be anything too complicated, but what I'm actually going to do is grab a bandpass. And if we take a listen here, then you can see that you get some interesting movement in that way. And so we can add another randomizer here to kind of introduce that and just kind of let that play on its own. Pretty interesting stuff, huh? Now, one thing that I am going to do before we go on any further is I'm actually going to add a limiter to this. We're going to make that just a little bit louder. And whenever we combine kind of all these things here in general, it can sound really nice whenever we get into doing the pitch kind of like stuff. And that sounds pretty good to me. One other thing that I might want to consider, though, is actually even doing a little bit more detuning to this. Typically, I go pretty far with that, actually, up to here. Now, one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that whatever synthesizer you're using, the detuning engine, or the unison engine, rather, is going to behave differently. So don't think that two voices is going to work in the same way as you would do this in something like Serum. And it's just because of the algorithm of which like these things are built, right? I find that like in Serum or so, I usually like 4 voices, and Vital, I usually end up using 3 voices. It doesn't really matter. Just play around with it until you find something that you like, and don't worry about recreating this timbre exactly. That's really important. Don't worry about recreating this timbre exactly. It's not that important. So now that we have a little bit more detuning, we've got something like this. And now that we've got a little bit of movement here, let's go ahead and bring this a little bit more alive by adding another instance of movement to both the cutoff here. I'm going to pull this down a little bit, turn the slope to 6, and then also pull down the resonance here. And now this is going to make this kind of do some interesting talking and stuff because of the notch opening and closing while also sweeping the frequency range. Cool. Now we introduced a cool trick earlier with the note. So one thing that you can do, as long as you're aware of it, and you don't have to do it, but one thing that's, sometimes cool to do is to actually add the same note stuff to the randomization here. So we can pull that down and do that on all fronts. So that way, whenever we do pitching, it's actually going to make this move faster to kind of mirror or to match the movement that we get whenever we get that super fast detuning at the higher pitch. Now that's a little bit too fast for me, so I'm going to go ahead and pull this up a bit. Same thing for here. Same thing for here. Nice. Now, the next thing that we're going to get into is a little bit of multipass, and I'm not going to talk about super filtering and stuff from here, but we're just going to introduce just a little bit of stereo, and this is going to kind of pre-frame getting into the next part, which we'll talk about like filtering and stuff. But some easy things that you can think about is getting into what's called frequency splitting, and really that's kind of self-explanatory in that sense, but what you do is you divide the output into anywhere from 2 to 5 bands here, just from multipass in general. You can do however many you want, but usually I only do 2 or 3. And so you have the ability to control certain aspects of the frequency range that you can make effects applied. Now, one thing that you want to keep in mind is that I would definitely encourage you to experiment, but a lot of times when people talk about doing frequency splitting and going crazy with effects, it's good to go the extreme route and figure out what everything does, but a lot of times you don't need that many effects in order to make something quote unquote interesting. So I'm going to kind of focus on these 2 regions for now. The first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that the low end is in mono, and that's going to kind of help protect us and make sure that we still have a solid fundamental. So if I were to solo this, there's movement within this bass, but I don't have any phase cancellation. And you can go anywhere from, say, 80 to 200 hertz. It really just depends on what it is that you're looking for, but I kind of like to be a little bit risque and make this pretty low in this region. The middle is kind of where all the movement happens, and again, we'll talk about this when we get to the filtering aspect of things, but if we take a listen to this, there's a lot that we can do with this in general. If we take a listen to this, that's just kind of the sizzle on top, and so if anything, we can think about either spreading that out really wide or adding more distortion depending on how much crunch we want with this. But again, this is where we're going to notice most of the differences that we kind of throw into it, just because our ears are tuned to this frequency range in general. 3K is the sweet spot, which I guess would be here. That's because that's usually where babies cry. But again, that's, you know, this is what you feel, this is what you notice, or this is what you hear, and then this is kind of the energy. That's just a really easy rule of thumb in general. So as far as getting into some stereo processing, you don't really have to go crazy with it, but if you just give yourself a little bit of something like chorus, turn the spread down, turn the mix down, that kind of helps you have a little bit of a thicker sound, and then you can get into some other experimental things as well that we'll talk about whenever we get to the neuro processing side of things, like pitch shifting, short delays, and all that other stuff. But to keep things kind of simple, something that you might want to practice is just doing an easy little ensemble right here, turning the mix down by quite a bit, and then pulling the spread down to give it just a little bit of kind of motion on top. This is cool because it says 6 voices, but if you actually click on this, you can go up to 16. You usually don't need that much, but you can experiment if you want. So that sounds pretty cool. It's nothing, you know, too crazy, hopefully so far, for the length of this video. But what we can do is kind of go into something like this and this. Set this to random on 4 out of 16 and just kind of mess with the mix a bit and kind of let these do their own thing. Now I know that this video has kind of been a lot to cover, but we haven't really done that much stuff compared to what I usually do in that sense. And so just by adding a few effects here, I mean 1 effect per band, and just by adding a little bit of extra stuff over in this region, we've already got a lot to work with. Now in particular, I probably would actually back off of doing the chord aspect of things. I kind of just wanted to show you that as a possibility, but let's take a listen and see how this sounds with just the octave. Not too bad. I think that we can actually push this a little bit further as well. And because we can take advantage of some of the unison movements between this, we can actually change this into synthetic. And I really like how this sounds. It's almost kind of like what I was talking about towards the kind of middle point of the video where it sounds like it's tearing on its own. I'm going to turn the slope up on this too and really focus in on this low middle region here. Awesome. Let's go ahead and finish up to make this something that's somewhat usable on its own. So what I'm going to get into now is a couple more things. I'm going to introduce a reverb over the entire signal. And instead of leaving it on, I'm actually going to change this to opening and closing, kind of like that. And this is going to kind of go from being a dry signal to super wet and big. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a filter. I'm actually going to do that here. And I'm going to give this an independent randomizer, say 1/4. And I'm going to change the cutoff here, kind of in this way, and maybe leave it more towards the high end. Now, the effect chain is actually kind of important once you get to this stage, because if you put the reverb under the filter, then it's going to be closed most of the time. But if you leave the reverb after this, it's actually going to sound a lot more interesting. The thing that is also going to matter a lot is the speed of things. I'm going to turn the notes up to 24 and hopefully reduce this by just a bit, and maybe see if we can get back to making all this stuff a little bit quicker. And again, for me, like I'm kind of doing this on the fly. I didn't really have any particular sound in mind. I kind of just wanted to show you the general processing aspect of things that I do. You really want to kind of just use your ears and use your intuition that you will develop over time as a sound designer in general. Sounds pretty good. I'm going to give this just a little bit of movement downwards and see if we can make this move a little bit faster whenever we pitch that up as well. Not too bad. Let's go ahead and clean this up. So I'm going to do what I do on every single patch pretty much, which is add the kilohertz version of OTT, which is actually technically the dynamics, the overachiever aspect. I've kind of made my own version of that off of that preset, which is kind of the same exact thing. You just turn off the low band and you turn off the super high band, and then kind of turn the mix to 50%. That gives it a little bit more high-end presence. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come back into multipass here and do the same thing that we were talking about, which is making sure that the low end is in mono. And then finally, we're going to add in just a little bit of dynamics here to control the sound in general. One thing that you're going to run into whenever you do a lot of experimental sound design is you're going to have crazy dynamics from the reaction of filters and effects that are interacting with each other. Now, the thing to keep in mind with that is that the more kind of like loud and quiet parts that you have within a single sound, the more compression that you want to add, because you don't want to have something that seems really quiet and then you're like, oh, it's so quiet, and you turn it up hella loud and then it blows your ears out, or, you know, blows your speakers. So that's typically why a lot of music that's like heavy and experimental in that region is so compressed in general. It's because in order to make it work, like, you got to like level everything out. Otherwise, it's going to be too freaking crazy and all over the place and like really uncontrollable in order to be usable. So once we kind of pull this down a little bit, which is kind of actually going to kind of mellow the volume out, then we can actually push the limiter a little bit harder in that way. Pretty cool. Now, from not really going too deep into filtering and going into some other neuroprocessing aspects, I think that this is a great starting place in order for you guys to be able to practice of just being able to build something that's actually usable by all means. If you don't like any aspect of the sound, or maybe in a sense like you like some parts but you didn't like the other parts, you can just take that out. Like, let's say you didn't like, you know, the high-end octave on this. You can either change it to something different, maybe like 7 semitones, and make it something like a chord. Maybe you don't want this at all and you just keep this. Maybe you want to keep everything consistent with the randomization, but you don't want it to move with the pitch. You can turn that off too, which is totally fine as well. Or maybe you want to go into like making things a lot more deep within the source sound itself, or use something, you know, kind of different than that. You can always kind of turn all this stuff off, which is really convenient, without having to do too much work, and go in and add something else, like maybe a wavetable or so. Let's say, you know, you want to do something in this region and like you're like, man, I don't really know that this is like going to be different enough. So instead, I'm going to introduce a little bit of FM modulation to the phase here. You can also do AM modulation over here, thanks Data Broth. And if you want to kind of switch up the sound in that way, then you can add FM and make it more interesting. I actually think that sounds pretty cool. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. And then what we can do is add the wavetable positioning here. And I know that we're just using a simple wavetable, but this is kind of cool because it will kind of sweep across in that way and kind of continue to help evolve the sound without doing like crazy filtering or so. Crazy, right? So what we can also do is we can take a same randomizer or so, and we can go and add this little star right here. And so what this is that it allows us to modulate a modulator. So this is dictating how much of the phase is going, and then that will kind of also move with the wavetable. Then all you have to do is kind of turn everything else back on. And you can kind of see like how much, like how far you can get into with this, right? And this isn't even exploring all the options. I mean, there really is just too many options to cover. You can change the wavetable if you want. If you're working in an analog type thing, then you can start to add sync to this. So which is actually kind of cool. So maybe you wanted to do another one here, and let's just pull this down to a faster randomizer in this way. You can add in this sync. And you guys see why I'm starting to choose randomizers and stuff now, right? That's because, for one, I don't have to like control all of these individual things at once, because that would be a nightmare in automation. But two, I can get to see how they interact with each other just by pushing F. And that to me is a lot more fun and a lot more exciting to kind of see what happens whenever you're exploring sound design in general, right? So take a listen to this. Cool. Now let's say maybe this is really interesting and stuff, but we want it to kind of open and close a lot more, which is kind of like the theme of what was going on. Well, all we have to do really is just kind of go back to this last filter here and just pull this all the way up and this way. And then let me see, this is random here. I'm going to go and find out whatever that's controlling. Okay, here we go. In that sense, let's make this just a little bit faster and turn the jitter up. And this will make this open and close a lot more. Yeah, so it gets pretty cool and exciting from there. So I think that without, again, going too far into detail and stuff, we notice that there's a lot of different ways, especially within phase plant, that you can introduce a lot of movement and a lot of interest just by taking advantage of the oscillator controls and then doing, I guess, like some light filtering and stuff. We're only using 2 filters here. I guess 3. Yeah, we're only using 2 for now because we turned the other thing off. We have a notch filter and a low pass, and that's not frequency dependent. It's just on the entire sound. And that's an easy way to get just kind of the ball rolling. So don't think that you have to do like crazy filtering and stuff, even though we'll go into that later. But you can kind of see that having the right combination of things with the right mindset can give you some interesting results in that way. This stuff over here is just like how to make it actually work. But this stuff over here and then this stuff is kind of like what gives it the characteristic and the timbre of what it is that we're looking for, right? And if, by all means, like I said before, if you don't like any of this stuff, then you can always just turn it off. I think that I like the stereo aspect of that, but depending on how you like to mix your tune, assuming that you know a thing or two about mixing, you can keep everything in mono if you want, or you can push the multipass stereo quote unquote aspect of this and then make it mono again, and you'll get something else that's interesting sometimes. I mean, heck, you can even do that and put the stereo at the end of the chain. But because you have the ability to kind of have so much freedom within all this stuff, because like Faceplant in general is semi-modular, and you can do the same thing on external effects outside of here as well, which we'll talk about later. But you have the ability to do those kinds of things, then it's just a matter of mixing and matching and figuring out what you like, as opposed to, am I making the right choice? So to kind of recap, we started with a very simple waveform. We added a notch filter right in between after detuning it to kind of give it that more prominent movement with some basic distortion. Then we pushed it through an EQ. We added that cool little distortion trick where you kind of move this and set this to mono in that way. Once we kind of had a nice little timbral sound, we went into multipass and gave it some stereo. And then we kind of finished up the quote-unquote timbre of the sound with the filter and reverb. Somewhere in between that, we also kind of explored the idea of having maybe a secondary voice on here with either a chord or, you know, a seventh with a bandpass. And this doesn't have to be a bandpass, it can be anything, but you can layer multiple like kind of quote-unquote oscillator groups and also do like different like means of splitting. And then finally, to make things more interesting, we introduced some sync and then also some FM modulation from a wavetable on the outside. We added an OTT, we made sure that the low end was in mono here, and then gave it some compression in order to control the sound, then finally pushed the limiter up to 0 dB. So in that sense, hopefully this was a very in-depth kind of, how do you say, explanation of how to get yourself up and running in something like Faceplant, or heck, you can even do most of this stuff in Serum or like with external processing with a DAW or something. But I really kind of just wanted to walk you guys through about my mindset about what it is going into how to make a sound like this, without having to explore, I guess, the other nuanced things of, you know, crazy filtering or making it quote unquote like NEURO or whatever in that sense. Because this is quote unquote a NEURO based, but the processing on it is pretty light compared to like the more experimental side of effects with things. So in part 2, we'll cover filtering. Part 3, we will cover like making it more of a low roaring NEURO based type thing with the same patch. And then in part 4, we will add the generator aspect of these things and figure out how to control it all at once. So thank you guys so much for watching my content. If you guys didn't know, I have preset packs available on my website. I recently released Eternum that has some crazy sounds kind of like this from before. There's a trailer on it on my YouTube channel. Go watch it and see if it's interesting to you or not. But any kind of interaction that you can give, help me get back into the algorithm, all that other good stuff, and just, you know, help me grow my channel. Long story short, if you guys like this kind of content, so I can keep doing it. But thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to stick around for part 2, and I will see you guys in the next one.